Let's open our Bibles to the Gospel by Matthew, chapter 6. In the Gospel by Matthew, Jesus Christ, in the 33rd verse, reduces down the goal of each of our lives to a very simple target. Jesus says this, "But seek ye first." Now that's simple, isn't it? First. Jesus said it. He spoke to us who know and love him. He said, I want you to simply, in your life, have this goal. Seek first the kingdom of God, basileia, the rule, the reign. Seek God's rule over every part of your life. And his righteousness and everything else will fall into place. That's my paraphrase of the ending, and all these things shall be added to you. What a simple goal that Jesus presents. A simple yet powerful word. The reason for this word is that ever since the Garden of Eden and mankind's fall into sin, we as humans have wanted our own way, not God's. Submission in biblical terms is when we submit to wanting God's way in every part of our life. Before we talk about grace-energized submission in wives, we need to talk about God's demand and command to each of us to want his way. Submission is all about wanting the way of God in our lives. Jesus said it's simple. Seek it first. Seek first, verse 33, the kingdom of God, God's rule. God is king. Do you remember how the early church was described when they were turning the towns upside down with all kinds of protests over Paul's ministry? Do you remember the accusation against the believers? It said they have another king named Jesus. That's what they said about him in Thessalonica. They got that from Paul's preaching. That Christians were submitting to the rule of a higher authority over them than even the emperor or the empire. That there was another king. And his name was Jesus. We should seek his rule. Submission in biblical terms is when we submit to wanting God's way. When sin entered into the world, and the woman began to desire to rule over her man, and the man desired to rule over his woman, both departed from their God-ordained roles in life. The fall of Genesis 3 has impacted every part of life, including marriage. This morning we're going to look at grace-energized submission for wives in the context of marriage. But before we do that, we have to see the much larger picture of sin and our need to submit to God's way. And even in marriage, husbands and wives, even when they're believers, still have this fallenness that makes us want to compete for our own way. If you really think about most conflicts in life come down to a competition between my way and your way, between his way and her way, between their way and someone else's way. And all this is a reflection of our fallenness. That all we, like sheep, Isaiah said, 53:6, have gone astray, and we are seeking out each one our own way. The ultimate sin, all of us are equally guilty of this morning, is wanting our own way. Even the precious little ones from birth want their own way. And God says salvation is when we submit to his way and we consciously subject ourselves to his gracious lordship of our lives. Well, instead of Christ-like leadership in the home as a biblical head over his wife, the typical man nowadays has become either dominant and forceful or passive and uncaring. You know, we have both ends of the spectrum. The fall has not only made dominant, tyrannical men, it's also made passive, uncaring men. And most families have somewhere in that spectrum with the husband. And in reaction, the typical woman and wife has either resisted the dominant, tyrannical type, or has become the leader she never was designed to be, kind of by default. And we're talking about in Christian homes. And we see this constant challenge of God's pattern and of our fallenness showing up. That whole distortion began way back in the garden. Biblical submission in marriage can only be understood in practice when seen in the wider context, We have to see not just the one little point that we're looking at in Titus 2:5 this morning, wives, be subject to your own husbands, and the echo of that throughout the Scriptures. Not just that little point, but the much wider picture that God says that we must submit to Him, and that has implications on every one of our lives, not just husbands and wives, but every one of our lives. First and before all other commands, God commands each of us that we must first submit to Him. Now, Jesus said it very simply here, seek first the kingdom of God. Now, a kingdom has a king and subjects, and that's all. A king and everyone else is a subject, subjected, in subjection, in obedience, in submission. So seek first the kingship of God, and submission to Him, Jesus said, was our responsibility. James chapter 4 and verse 7 echoes the same command. It says, submit yourself, therefore, to God. It's an imperative. We must choose to obey. We must choose to submit ourselves to God. We weren't born submissive. We were born unsubmissive. We were born wanting our own way. Salvation gives us the power of God to say, yes, we will submit. We will seek your rule over every part of our life, over every day of our life. And that's our joyful desire. We learn to surrender to God and seek His rule on a daily basis, as it says here in Matthew 6:33. Well, then after submission to Him, God also commands that we have a lot of other realms of submission. He is established. God has order. He has hierarchy. He has roles. He has very specific plans for the way that this world should run. Whether it runs that way or not is just a reflection of mankind's sinfulness and rebellion. But God's rule stands, and for all who break it, there's this unending pursuit of the wrath of God against sin that is sometimes withheld, but it is coming, as Revelation 19 shows. It's inescapable, and all will someday face the one that they rebelled against. But God has established in His divine plan many other realms of submission that we're not going to really investigate fully. All of us to God, and then individually, congregations are to submit to their elders, Hebrews 13:17. Citizens are to submit to their rulers, 1 Peter 2:13. Younger believers are to submit to older or mature believers, 1 Peter 5:5. And that's much of what Titus 2 that we're looking at this morning is all about. The older training the younger and guiding them and leading them and showing them how they should submit to the gracious lordship of Christ in their life.